YouTube. Welcome back to my channel, True Crime Revealed. Today's story is going to take place in the year of 1979 in the Soho neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, New York. It involves missing minor and murdered child Etan Patz. If you are familiar in the true crime world, you may be very familiar of his name. He's one of the famous children that went missing in the late 1970s and ultimately was one of the first faces to be seen on milk cartons for missing children in the 1980s. In today's case, we're going to talk about the events that led up to the case, the murder case itself, and the findings after the case by investigators. I want to say thank you to my subscribers. We have reached 100 subscribers on True Crime Revealed, and I just want to appreciate the support of everyone watching, commenting, and subscribing to this channel. Let's go ahead and get started on the murder of Etan Patz.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel True Crime Reveal. Today's story is going to be about the murder of Etan Patz. Now this takes place in the Big Apple, New York City in the late 70s. And he is notably one of the most famous missing children cases that kicked off the late 70s into the early 80s. He actually was monumental in his case for how they deal with missing children's cases. They've also signed into Act Missing Children's Day because of Etan Patz, and ultimately he's one of the first kiddos to appear as a missing child on a milk carton in the 1980s. So Etan Patz is a very, very prominent child figure from the late 70s into the 80s. And this is a case that has basically stunned the world, along with Adam Walsh. These were just these big highlighted cases in the late 70s and early 80s. It was ultimately a beginning of a new era of different crimes that were cropping up more and more and surfacing in the media. So let's go ahead and get started with the story of the murder of Etan Patz. Etan Patz was born on October 9th, 1972 in Manhattan, New York. He is the son of Julie Patz and Stanley Patz. Julie ran a household daycare out of their home, and Stanley was a photographer. He is the middle child of Shira Patz and Ari Patz. Etan Patz was 6 years old at the time of his disappearance, and he is described by his parents to be a sweet, kind little boy who loved playing with his friends and had a genuine good heart. He is told to have a smile that could light up the world. Etan was 6 years old in the first grade, and he was the middle child, so he wasn't really the baby of the family, but he wasn't the oldest kid either. But he was getting to a point where he wanted to feel responsible and wanted to do things by himself. He's 6 years old, so at this point, he's learning how to tie his shoes, he's learning how to cross the street with his parents. He basically wants to be a little man, so he tells his parents that he wants to be able to walk to the bus stop by himself, which is only about 2 blocks away from his home. Now, while Etan is just a little boy in the big city of New York, the Soho neighborhood was said to have been a very close-knit city where everyone knew each other and it was fairly safe. And again, this is in the late 1970s. And this is a time where kids are playing outside until dark. Parents are saying, hey, once it gets dark, come back home. Kids are walking to the stores by themselves. And not everyone is doing this, but a lot of people are. And it wasn't really that weird for kids to do that. It was just one of those times where people felt a lot safer. So his parents are not really 100% on letting him go by himself. He keeps begging them, he keeps asking them, and they realize that he's only 6 years old, but they also realize that the Soho neighborhood is pretty close knit. Everyone knows everyone. There's not a lot of this missing kids going on at this time. So they figure hey, we'll let him go by himself to walk to the bus stop. And this is actually going to be the last day before the long Memorial Day weekend. And he is so excited. He has $1 with him that he earned that he wants to spend. And he is so excited to go walk to the bus stop, and his parents have no idea that this is actually going to be the last moment that they ever see him. Stan Pates recounts that he was actually in the bathroom shaving, getting ready for work. He had a really important photo shoot that morning, and Julie was actually getting ready with her other two kids. Her 2-year-old was needing some attention, and the 8-year-old was just kind of lollygagging, getting ready kind of slowly. So, because of all of that, she didn't really have the opportunity to watch Etan as he exited to go onto Prince Street to walk to the bus stop. And also, they stayed on the 3rd floor in their apartment, so there really wasn't a need for him to take an elevator. They just typically would take the stairs. But again, this particular morning, there was just so much going on with Julie and the other kids, and Stan getting ready for that important photo shoot. They don't really watch Etan as he's walking away. And again, this is the perfect storm for his ultimate disappearance. Now, keep in mind, Julie actually ran a household daycare of several children. So there was a lot of moving pieces as to what was going on in that morning between that situation, her trying to get her other children ready, and also Stan trying to hurry up and get ready for the photo shoot. There was a lot of moving parts as to what happened that morning, ultimately, before Etan leaves on Prince Street headed toward the bus stop. So, on the morning of May 25th, 1979, his family is busy getting ready for the day. Etan leaves his Soho apartment that morning, which is located at 113th Prince Street, by himself for the first time. He's planning on walking these 2 blocks by himself to get on his school bus at the corner of West Broadway and Prince Street. Now, the morning that Etan went off to school, he was said to be wearing a blue corduroy jacket, blue jeans, and blue sneakers with fluorescent stripes. He also was wearing a black Future Flight Captain pilot cap. So he was decked out, looking super cute, ready to go to first grade, ready to go by himself, ready for the Memorial Day weekend to come up, only to go missing sadly that morning. Now, Etan never makes it to school. He never makes it to the bus stop. And it's stated that the last place that he was seen was in the area of a bodega, a shop not too far from his home, and where the bus stop was actually in near that vicinity. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the last whereabouts and ultimately what is presumed to have happened. We're going to talk a little bit about that here shortly. Now, the entire school day goes by and Etan was nowhere to be found at school. His teacher doesn't really report to the parents that Etan's not there. Again, this is the late 70s, and this is not really how they handle it as they do today. Now, today, if a student's not there, you're going to get a call. If the parent did not call in and say, hey, my kiddo is going to be absent, and they call the attendance line, cool. But if you do not call, you're going to get a call from the school, from the counselor, the assistant principal. Someone in attendance is going to call you and say, hey, are you aware that your kiddo is not here? Of course, for teenagers and high schoolers, they could be playing hooky possibly. But in a lot of cases, like this one, if the student is not in the class, something may have happened while they were en route to trying to get to school, whether that's getting on a school bus or public transportation. There are so many stories where kiddos and teens actually go missing while trying to get to school, like in the case of Etan Patz. So Julie realizes he does not come home when he's supposed to after school, and she calls the authorities immediately to figure out what's going on. She also contacts her husband, Stan, and she tells him, hey, Etan is not here. I don't know where he is. He has not been at school all day. We need to figure out what's going on. So Stan actually gets back from where he was during the day working. It doesn't even take him about 15 minutes to come back home. And he immediately goes into his dark room and he finds all of the photographs that he's taken of Etan so that he can create some missing posters for the 6-year-old. So this is in many ways a lot of parents' worst nightmares. Your child not coming back home, your child coming up missing, vanishing without a trace. It is something that no parent should have to go through, and I cannot imagine what Jill and Stan Patz were feeling in knowing that their 6-year-old was missing. I saw a clip from ABC that was really, really interesting and just kind of showing the depth of what was going on and how the Pateses felt. I'm going to play a quick clip of Stan and then I'll be back.
At some point in every parent's life, they send their children to school alone. Yeah. Did we do it too early? Obviously we did. It was very familiar territory. This was a very safe neighborhood. When you let them out of your sight, when they're 21?
Back upstairs, Julie could have followed some of Etan's path from their fire escape, but today she got busy with their other children. And Stan, a commercial photographer, went about his day with a photo shoot uptown.
It had to be at least 3 o'clock. Julie called and she said that Etan had not come home from school. I was probably down here in about 15 minutes and came up here and...
It's all still right there, isn't it?
At some point he must have realized that things were going bad. And I still gag with the fear that this child must have felt. When he realized he was betrayed by an adult.
That interview is really, really hard to watch. It is touching. It's heartbreaking. If you have a chance, you guys can look it up to see the full interview for ABC. But it is just sad seeing this poor father just recounting the day that it happened and wondering what his child, his 6-year-old baby boy's last thoughts were in knowing that things were going wrong, that he was in trouble, that he probably would not be able to escape, that he was going to be hurt, that his mom and dad and his sisters and brothers were not there to help him. And ultimately, what stands out to me the most is when Stan Patz says the thought of how his precious baby boy, Etan, felt in knowing that he had been betrayed by an adult. This innocent 6-year-old trusted this individual. He thought that they were nice and ultimately they were there to hurt him. Really, really difficult for these parents to have to digest what's happened, and they remained hopeful. I know his wife, Julie, in my research and watching various interviews, remained very hopeful. Like the Walshes, they thought that he was alive for a long time. They were not going to accept that anything really bad had happened to him, and they just really remained hopeful. But of course, we know that that was unfortunately not the case. Now, like in so many other missing children's cases where these kiddos disappear, guess who is going to be prime suspect number one? Guess who investigators are going to ask questions to first? Of course, the parents. So Stanley and Julie are both implicated in the murder as persons of interest just because they're the last ones to see him alive. And that's tough on any parent who has a missing child to have to be questioned and borderline kind of accused and looked at sideways as possibly having something to do with the murder. But as we know, in a lot of cases, sometimes parents are actually the perpetrators. So it makes sense that investigators and police are questioning them first. However, they quickly realize that Stanley and Julie have absolutely nothing to do with this, and they are distraught and just as much, if not more, concerned with investigators as to finding where their 6-year-old went. So even though this is extremely stressful for Etan's parents, they are very, very cooperative with the police and are soon ruled out of any implications that they have anything to do with Etan's disappearance. So now the search and the hunt for finding Etan Patz is on. There are about 100 police officers that are searching for Etan. They also have a team of bloodhounds basically scouring the city looking for Etan to see what traces are left behind, to see if they are any types of evidence that will be able to bring the 6-year-old home. This search goes on for several weeks. They have neighbors that are interviewed in the city. They have missing child posters that are everywhere. They had a wealth of photos that were able to be presented to the investigators thanks to Stan and him being a photographer and taking so many wonderful pictures of his son. A lot of these photos actually were put up on screens in Times Square, missing child posters everywhere. And then, of course, in the mid 80s, he was also placed on some milk cartons as well. So, this is definitely a face that the world has known and has seen for decades. Despite everyone knowing his face, everyone knowing his story, poor Etan Patz's body till this day has never been found. And now, what I'm going to talk about is the possible suspects in the case and the actual prime suspect who has actually admitted to murdering this 6-year-old boy. Now, I'd like to discuss some of the prime suspects in the case. In 1985, the United States Attorney Stuart Grabos actually received this particular case, and he identified Jose Antonio Ramos as one of the prime suspects in this particular case. Now, Jose had a bit of a sordid past. He was actually a convicted child sexual abuser and pedophile. And in the investigation, Stuart Grabo and investigators actually learned that Ramos was actually a friend of Etan Patz's former babysitter and a primary suspect in the case in 1982. It was a specific case where there were multiple boys who accused Ramos of trying to lure them to a drain pipe where Ramos was living. And when they searched the drain pipe, it was actually discovered that they found photographs of Ramos and the young boys who at the time had actually kind of resembled Etan. So he was actually really familiar with being a pedophile. That was just what he did. Grabos eventually found that Ramos had been in custody in Pennsylvania in connection with an unrelated child molestation case. So he had a really bad rap and was actually a prime suspect in this particular case at the time. Now, things got really sticky in the investigation when Grabos actually interviewed Ramos, and he stated that on the day that Etan Patz disappeared, he had actually taken a young boy back to his apartment to rape the young boy, and then he stated that he was quote-unquote 90% sure that it was the boy that he later saw on the television news when all of these reports and missing photos were going out of Etan Patz. He never uses his names, but he claims that he put the boy on a subway going quote-unquote uptown. And back in 1991, while Ramos was incarcerated for all of his other dirty deeds, there was actually a jailhouse informant that actually told Grabos and an FBI agent that he knew exactly what happened to Etan and that he even drew a map of Etan's school bus route, including the stop that was actually third on the route for Etan where he actually was supposed to be picked up that day. So Ramos was a prime suspect all along. But however, in the 1980s, authorities were just unable to prosecute Ramos just because there wasn't a ton of evidence. Number one, poor Etan's body is missing. They can't even find the body, and there's just not a lot to go off of as far as evidence goes. So there was just a lot based on evidence as far as testimony of other people and what they had to say. And ultimately, the person that actually goes down for committing this crime is someone that actually confessed to it, which we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. But there's just not a ton of evidence in this particular case, which is so unfortunate. So I've actually located a few news reports where Ramos is actually being interviewed, and it's just chilling the way that he behaves. Now, whether or not he had something to do with Etan Patz's disappearance is neither here nor there. This man has been convicted of actually harming children in the past, and he's just very creepy. And he is the prime suspect in the 80s going into 90s in this case, and I can see why. He's totally creepy. He seems like there's something definitely wrong with him, and I personally believe that he had some type of knowledge and involvement in this particular case. I'm going to let you guys know exactly who was prosecuted in the end, but I can see why this man was the prime suspect. So I'm going to go ahead and play a couple of clips of these reports, and then I'll be back.
In 1991, Grabois appeared on ABC's Primetime Live. So did Jose Ramos. When I interviewed them, Grabois already believed Ramos was involved in Etan's disappearance.
Stuart Grabois calls you a pedophile.
I don't feel I was a total pedophile.
Isn't that like saying I'm just a little bit pregnant? I mean, how can you be
No,
either
no, no,
you're
no,
either
no,
a pedophile or not a pedophile?
No. Don't go into that connotation of that. I was a little mentally unstable.
At the time, Ramos knew that Grabois was after him, but he did not know this.
There was a plan in place to try to obtain additional statements from Jose Antonio Ramos.
The plan will eventually involve a rookie FBI agent.
I mean, there are moments in this case that are beyond chilling.
And jailhouse informants.
He even drew me a map of Etan's route on a school bus. He knew exactly where the school bus stopped.
Don't put your hands on me. Don't put your hands on me now, because I have my own energy.
I'm not going to put my hands
Don't
on
take
you.
your energy off of me.
I'm curious that
Because
you're
now-
so appalled at the
Yes.
possibility of me touching
Yes.
you, which of course I'm not
Yes.
interested in doing.
Yes.
You're
Why?
the man who
Why?
molested
Right.
children.
Now, you listen to me. Why? Because I don't do that anymore. And I don't want you to put your hands on me, because that's where it starts. Okay? Now, you get that straight.
That's how you started,
That's how I started, and I don't want that anymore. Okay?
by putting your hands on me.
Right.
Wow, just chilling. I just wanted to share those clips with you because this individual deserves to be behind bars. If he had nothing to do with Etan Patz's death, that's one thing, but he is a terrible person, and the interviews just give me chills just knowing how evil. I mean, if you watch it, the evil just emits from him. But the Patzes actually were convinced for a long time that Ramos was behind this. They actually had a civil judgment that was against him for $2 million. They never collected on it, and they actually closed the case when the actual prosecuted murderer was actually prosecuted. They just basically kind of canned that particular case against Ramos. But for several years, on the anniversary of the disappearance and the birthday, they actually would send him a missing child poster of Etan Patz stating, "What did you do with my little boy?" And Ramos, of course, has always maintained his innocence, that he had nothing to do with this particular disappearance. Investigators had a hard time trying to find evidence in this particular case just because poor Etan Patz's body is never found, and there's not really a ton of research for the investigators to do because there's not a lot of evidence in this particular case. So that's why it's a lot of confessions and a lot of testimony that they go over in this particular case. Now in 2012, they did go back to this area at 127B Prince Street just to basically investigate and search. And after 4 days, they stated that there was nothing that they were able to find in the particular basement that was a workshop and a storage space of a specific handyman. So they did go back to that location, but were able to find nothing. Now, this is actually a shot of the basement where prosecutors and investigators surmise the actual murder of Etan took place in 1979. And this is actually where the location is excavated so that they could figure out if they could find anything. And again, after a 4-day search, nothing was actually found in this particular location. So that was fruitless and very difficult for investigators and prosecutors to take in because they're trying to find any evidence that they can, but there just wasn't any there. Now, it's going to move on to our actual suspect who confesses. This is the bodega, the street corner shop where it is believed Etan Patz was last alive. This is actually where our prime suspect, who is actually prosecuted, Pedro Hernandez, was actually working at the time at the age of 19 years old. So in 1979, Pedro Hernandez is about 18 or 19 years old, and he actually works at the convenience store, the neighborhood bodega, if you will. And he basically states that Etan Patz had about $1 and he was going to buy a drink to go with his lunch that day. And this is ultimately where the deed happens, and he is ultimately murdered. And he states that he strangled him. He had never seen this little boy before. It just kind of happened, and he had absolutely no plan in doing this. It just happened out of nowhere. So I'm going to show a clip of him admitting to this, and then I'll be back to discuss it.
And Etan Patz, was he ever around the store at another time?
I never seen that kid in my life.
And Etan Patz never came into the store?
I never seen him.
You never saw him in the store, or you never saw him, period?
Never seen him in the store, never seen him before.
You had never seen him before?
Never.
Mm-hmm. When you did see him, how long was he standing there before you approached him?
5 minutes.
Were you watching him? Or were you going up and down the stairs? What were you doing during these 5 minutes?
I went to the store, put the sodas in the store, come back out. And I stand in front of the store, and there he was, in the front of the store.
Mm-hmm.
Then I approached him and I asked him if he wanted something to drink.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't answer me. He nodded his head. I went down to the basement, he followed me to the basement. And whatever happened there, I choked him. It was something that just happened like quick. I don't know why I did it. I don't know how it happened.
As you talk about it, are you surprised?
I don't even know if it happened.
So that is the interview and ultimately the confession of Pedro Hernandez in the disappearance and murder of Etan Patz. As you can see, his story is just a little weird. He, at the end, says, I don't even know if it happened. And later on, his lawyer states that he was actually diagnosed with hallucinations and personality disorders, and he had a low IQ of about 70. So in a similar case that we saw with the Walsh case as well, the murderer in that story also had a low IQ. So I'm noticing a lot of trends here with these confessions when there's not like a ton of evidence. But lo and behold, they have a trial in 2015, and it's actually a mistrial just because they have 11 against 1. And in my research, the one juror that found him not guilty again stated that there was just not enough evidence against him, and that's why he said he ultimately thought he was not guilty in the mistrial. As far as where Etan Patz's body is, Pedro Hernandez states that he actually took a bag and he folded up Etan's body in the bag and took it out of the bodega and went and just disposed of it in a trash can, basically, and a dumpster. And he's stating that that's how he got rid of it, and that's why till this day we do not know where Etan Patz's body is. Now, in the year of 2001, on June 19th, Etan's body is actually never found still, and they actually declare him as being legally dead. So it took several years for them to do this. I know that the Patzes basically kept hope alive that he would come home one day. They actually did not move out of that home that they were in for several years. They never changed their phone number in hopes that their baby boy would come home or would call one day. But in the year 2001, it's actually declared that Etan is most likely dead. Now, as for Pedro Hernandez, in the year of 2017, they actually do find him guilty of kidnapping and felony murder. So they actually had a retrial that began in 2016. And in 2017, they actually are able to successfully sentence him to 25 years to life in prison. By April of 2017, the case was still opened, and ultimately, Hernandez was actually sentenced to life in prison. He does have a possibility of parole after serving at least 25 years. And so the Patzes, after hearing all of this and learning all of this, they basically do let the civil judgment against Ramos go, and they do accept that Hernandez is, in fact, the actual murderer of their son, Etan. It just really breaks my heart that these parents had to go through this, the fact that they stayed in that same Soho apartment until 2019. They lived there all those years hoping that their baby boy would come back home until they figured out that Hernandez actually was behind it. They finally moved out in 2019 and they sold the Soho apartment and they moved to Hawaii with their youngest son, Ari. But they kept hope alive all those years trying to stay in that particular apartment, even though they never really spoke of what happened after that day. Stan stated that his wife, Julie, never really spoke about it anymore afterwards. He would speak about it in interviews here and there, but it was just too painful for them to really mention it. But they did stay in the house for a total of 40 years after his disappearance before finally moving to Hawaii, like most of the New York snowboarders do. They'll go to Florida or maybe an island like Hawaii, and it's just heartbreaking that they lived most of their lives never really knowing exactly what happened to their son. So, like Adam Walsh, Etan Patz was a pioneer for how they deal with missing kiddos today. He actually was the inspiration for May 25th's National Missing Children's Day. That eventful day in 1979 on May 25th, when Etan Patz went missing, was actually declared a national day in 1983 on the anniversary of his disappearance. So that's the story today, guys. The tragic murder of Etan Patz. This case got a lot of media attention, as we talked about, and his disappearance has actually been credited to a lot of awareness that goes on now with the problems of child abductions. Because of this case, a lot of parents did not allow their children to walk to school anymore. They were able to start putting photos up of missing kiddos, right? Because of all of those photos that Stan had of his son. They also started cropping up on milk cartons, and also the term stranger danger is synonymous with Adam Walsh. The term stranger danger is a thing. Kids are essentially not as open to talking to strangers as they were in prior years as well. So this case was monumental in putting kiddos' faces out in the forefront and letting the public know that these predators exist. They're out there, and if given the opportunity, they will snatch your children and they will harm them if given the opportunity. So this case was monumental. I'm so sorry that poor Etan Patz had to lose his life. And as a result of this, a lot of positive things did come about. But I wanted to share his story because he was just an innocent 6-year-old little boy who wanted to walk to the bus stop by himself. So that is the case, guys. The murder of Etan Patz. I appreciate you guys so much for watching and tuning in. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much for the 100 subscribers. I'll have another story for you guys next week, and I'll see you in the next story. Bye now.